Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
1876. America celebrates its centennial. 100 years as a republic. 100 years in pursuit of the promise of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal.
You know, I always think of John Adams's comment that all men are created equal so long as you leave women and children out of the picture. You know, when they said men, it was gender specific. I'm quite convinced of that.
What I like is the sense that we understand that we are engaged in a struggle. and Frederick Douglass, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, all the ways in which sort of the civil rights struggle is basically about fulfilling the promise that is there, living up to the laws and the Constitution and all of that. I think that's really, really pivotal.
Waldo keeps talking about complicating things. I like that because he's also talking about simplifying, explaining them clearly, explaining that they are complicated.
Yeah, that's basically the point.
You know, the promise is out there. It's like this really great shining thing that everybody, you know, wants to believe in, but for a really long time, there are lots of people who are not expected to participate in that.
In 1876, is America fulfilling its most fundamental promise? Our team of historians probed this question today on A Biography of America.
Words in the culture, and when we talk about the American character, it may
On May 10th, 1876, President Ulysses Grant traveled to Philadelphia for an unusual birthday celebration. The United States was 100 years old. Nearly 10 million people, 1/5 of the country's population, came to Philadelphia to celebrate the progress and prosperity of America, even though the country was in the midst of its worst economic depression ever. New, life-transforming inventions were on display. The telephone, the typewriter, electric lights, the internal combustion engine. But the centerpiece was a 700-ton coreless steam engine, which symbolized the exposition's theme that machines were remaking America and promised to inaugurate an age of widespread abundance. In early July, the realities of American life intruded into the centennial celebration of industrial progress. A group of feminists, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, broke into the exposition's July 4th proceeding to read a document they called the Women's Declaration of Independence. These women had supported black liberation, supported the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But they felt outraged and betrayed when the 15th Amendment, which extended voting rights to black people, did not do the same for women. The same day of their protest, word reached the exposition that George Armstrong Custer and his 7th Cavalry had been wiped out at a place called Little Bighorn by a band of Sioux warriors led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. There were immediate calls for vengeance. The Indians would have to be dealt with violently. Grant's hopes for racial harmony didn't fare much better. That same centennial July 4th, 13 years to the day since Grant's victory at Vicksburg, whites in Hamburg, South Carolina, tried to prevent a group of black militia from marching in an Independence Day parade. When the case went to court 4 days later, fighting broke out between black people and a group of whites who were armed with a cannon. After the blacks surrendered, several of their leaders were murdered in cold blood. All of the whites were acquitted in a travesty that was called a trial. Grant sent troops and condemned the massacre as bloodthirsty and unprovoked. But the future solution to such outrages, he made clear, would have to depend on a higher power than the federal government. In his words, the great ruler of the universe. Frederick Douglass, who had been a supporter of the president, now questioned the nation's commitment to Lincoln's pledge of a new birth of freedom.
What is your emancipation? When you turned us loose, you gave us no acres. You turned us loose to the sky, to the storm, to the whirlwind. And most of all, you turned us loose to the wrath of of our infuriated masters.
Years later, W.E.B. Du Bois offered a more measured judgment. Reconstruction was, he said, a splendid failure. For a promising moment, black people took a gigantic step out of slavery with white help, and they were then pushed back into the dark night of racial suppression, abandoned by almost all their former allies. For all that was gained by courageous black people, what Reconstruction demonstrated was that racism was a national, not a regional scourge. As a nation, we continue to struggle with Reconstruction's unresolved legacy, with the inheritance of the painful question of race in America. If you open the door, the trap door to the unconscious, the trap door down into the past, what would fly out in 1876? What are these unresolved problems that are going to just haunt the conscience of the nation?
Well, I think one is very clear, the problem of race. I mean, 1876, we're at the end of Reconstruction. Technically, slaves have been freed, but what you begin to see with the decline of any kind of commitment to Reconstruction and the demise of Reconstruction is a turning back of any kind of modest clock in terms of any kind of progress. I think when you talk about Civil War, emancipation is a transformation. It is a revolution. Freedom for the ex-slaves is an important accomplishment. But what you discover is that Reconstruction does not provide the economic wherewithal, the political wherewithal to ensure the freedom of the ex-slaves. And so in 1876, it's not surprising to me that the struggles and the progress, in quotations, of African Americans or the ex-slaves in particular is pushed off into the side because it's not seen as central
well, isn't
to
it
the
even worse
ongoing
than that?
struggle.
I mean, what's happening here?
And I think there's this tendency toward historical amnesia. And let bygones be bygones. Forget about the past. Why grope among the dry bones of the past? There's a famous line from an Emerson essay. And there's that sense that America is about the future, and that one leaves one's past behind. As you succeed, you need not revisit those things. Of course, there's a price that's paid for that kind of amnesia, for that kind of erasure.
But you did have the abolition of slavery did take place, and you do have a new sense of unionism in 1876. So when you're at that centennial, you can say, hey, we made it for 100 years. And we're looking to the future. Believe me, there was a lot of patriotic gore in 1876 celebrating that 100th anniversary. And I think even travesties like the Civil War, which turned out to be good for the country in the sense of unifying the nation, getting away with the slavery issue finally, and the new technologies that came out of the Civil War, whether it's technologies in machine gunnery for war, or medicine in war, or submarines, or photography, or more improved communication cables with the telegraph. Pretty soon, instead of just telegraphing around the country, we'll be telegraphing to Europe. The building of the trains in the middle of the Civil War, while North is fighting South, Abraham Lincoln is signing the bill for the Transcontinental Railroad, connecting the East with the West, and so much of the next decades after the Civil War, connecting the country together through the railroad. So it's a kind of time, I think, of a new energy and optimism for a lot of Americans. Yet at the same time, it's still a period, as Waldo's saying, where we are free from slavery, thank goodness, but we still don't have equal rights. But everybody still seems to think that there's a chance of a better life somehow.
Well, I think it's hard to talk about everybody at that point because the news arrives at the 1876 Centennial Exhibition that the Custer debacle has just occurred at the Little Bighorn, that the Allied troops of various Plains Indian peoples have massacred and slaughtered all of the 7th Cavalry. And this is a devastating military loss for the United States. And it's a great victory for the people on the plains. They don't want to be a part of the United States. They don't want to be a part of this incorporated republic that builds an iron railroad across their land, that splits up the buffalo herd. And this is a moment for them when they suddenly think, maybe we can fight it back. There's still a war going on. It's not a war for the South. It's not a war to bring the South back to the Union, but it's a war in the West to incorporate those Western territories into the United States. And even as late as 1876, that's not a done deal. That's not a guaranteed thing.
Here, after the Civil War, you've got this giant engine that you've described, this industrial engine, a country that had already mobilized for war, knew how to fight a vast war. and a continental scale war, boom, they go out west, and it's all over. It's all over by the 1890s. It's that
I think
fast.
there's a different way to think about this, because I think there's a longer-term historical problem here, and that is that the peoples that Virginia is referring to have been there for a while, and they have seen struggle over a long term. And it strikes me that the short-term victory of quote-unquote manifest destiny is just sort of one part of a longer stream of struggle that a lot of these people have seen. They did not disappear. They did not vanish. They are still there. They have changed. They have been altered.
The Indians were caught in a juggernaut, you know, after
But why does victory come to be the standard of judgment? Why does victory come to be the way?
It's not the standard of judgment, but it's what happened.
Yeah, but see, victory is sort of, history is written by the victors. I mean, history is written by, quote-unquote, the people with history. The people without history, the native peoples, don't write the kind of history that we come
But Walter, you keep saying the native peoples as if they're one group of people that are native.
But if we tell the story as a story of conflict, as a story of contested values, as a story where there are native tribes who are being perhaps invaded, there are workers on the railroad who are being exploited, there are battles among the capitalists themselves. You know, this isn't just a story of capital against somebody else. You know, somebody wins and somebody loses.
And the triumphalism that Waldo is objecting to obviously comes out of the position of those who are triumphing, in effect. It's the sense that they are bringing civilization and progress.
But what's the agenda of the country here? What's the agenda of the country?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because, I mean, what has the nation just gone through? It's recently completed this civil war that threatened to tear this nation apart. And you would assume that there'd be lots of references to what the United States had been through from its founding. But the core of the Centennial is really an international exposition, showing off industry, technology, consumerism, and in all kinds of ways, if you were to go through that exhibition and look at what was displayed, the kinds of goods, the kinds of products, it really is a celebration of technology, and it harkens toward a future world separated from a past world.
Well, Don, go back to this question of what's going on in 1876. I wonder if, to some extent, what we aren't all saying is that the issues have changed in some fundamental way. Yes. And I'd like to take exception with the notion that we have a historical amnesia. 1876, I wonder if so many of those basic issues that had shaped politics and disputes before the war hadn't been settled. I mean, certainly there was the whole question of union. This was there from the time of the Constitutional Convention. Could the Union hold together? I think Appomattox Courthouse settled that. You can't just leave the Union. There's no right to leave the Union. The cost would be tremendous. Now, Waldo, I want to ask you something. It seems to me what's so interesting about the pre-Civil War period is that African Americans were active players. I mean, that they were in some ways the most ardent advocates of true universal rights and equality. And they were terribly important in part because they had allies, abolitionists, for example. What's happened to them? Why are they less forceful? I can't think that the African-American community has abandoned its championing of genuine equality and equal rights. Why are they less effective after the Civil War?
This is a very compelling question. At least as I think about it, it's not that the voices are not there. The problem is that the issues themselves, as you suggest, have become more complicated. For example, you get the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. You get the 14th Amendment, which clarifies the fact that African Americans are now citizens. And you get ultimately a 15th Amendment around issues of the vote, giving black men the vote. But these are contested issues. And all along the way, that sort of defining citizenship, deciding who gets the vote and who doesn't get the vote, some of the former allies are less enthusiastic about some of the ways in which those issues work themselves out, especially the vote. For example, one of the places where you can see this problem is in the debate over the 15th Amendment, the effort to give black men the vote. There is a debate, there's a strong, acrimonious, difficult debate, and ultimately there is a split between those who support the vote for black men, which excludes women, including black women. And there are those like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony who split ways with someone like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass supports the amendment which gives black men the vote, whereas Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton oppose it. And then they want to argue that, you know, women, especially white women, deserve the vote. So
Why did Douglas
ultimately,
oppose that?
he didn't oppose that. It was just the notion that in any kind of political development, there are going to be winners, there are going to be losers. You have to compromise. And his argument was, give black men the vote. Once we have the vote, we will continue the fight and join the fight to give women the vote. That's the next stage of the struggle. Now, a lot of women and a lot of supporters of the other point of view felt that this was too big a compromise, that you do not make this was where you drew the line in the sand, so to speak, and you fought it out on principle. And that kind of idealism, that kind of belief, Douglas felt had to be compromised at this point in time. Mm-hmm. But I do think that there is sort of a declining idealism around issues of race.
I guess it's a sense of inertia that sets in, or just a feeling that how long can this thing continue? The struggle for black rights. I mean, how long can it go on? We're getting tired of it.
Well, some of it's fatigue, but some of it is a question about how far is this movement for democracy going to go? And there is so much concern that that's just going too far, that that's just too much. So that African-American rights and white women's rights and black men's rights during this period will come to seem like, boy, that's just asking too much. One or the other, but not both.
Well, a question for you on this issue we keep talking about. We just fought a civil war. Almost 500,000 Americans are dead. You know, a million Southerners killed, wounded, or missing in action. The whole South has been devastated by the Civil War. Literally, Reconstruction meant physical Reconstruction as well. A new generation's on the scene. Their fathers had fought the Civil War. A younger generation, rising business people like Carnegie and Morgan who make money out of the war. Isn't it that the country wants to move on to something else, that it's tired, it's exhausted from the war and from Reconstruction?
I think this is one good explanation. I think the war idealism or the war concern generated about freedom for black people does decline.
In regard to this retreat from Reconstruction, it would be almost impossible for us to exaggerate the virulence of the racism that existed in the 19th century. And for many of these activists and for many of these participants, liberty was one thing, equality was something else.
Exactly.
And having gotten liberty, a lot of people felt, you know, that next step was too much. I mean, remember, Lincoln himself, while he's an opponent of slavery, favors colonization. There are all kinds of issues that are going around in this period in regards to this.
We're talking about a reformism movement here. You just had a civil war that was basically, if you think who's fighting the Civil War, these soldiers from the North, they're coming in to fight for unionism. That's what they originally went in. Yes, slavery became a big issue after the Emancipation Proclamation, even before. But it's over now. And people want to get back to a sense of normalcy. And what do people go home for? They're not going home for continuing reformism. Boy, now let's get more democracy. Let's get more people to vote. They want to make money. Unfettered capitalism is what starts kicking in after Reconstruction. People looking at a way to get more personal income, ways to get richer, ways to go into homestead schemes into the West, ways to go look for gold rushes and mining interest and starting new ranches. And it's that personal interest of wealth that people are looking for, or at least for a decent life.
But the larger forces at work in society seem to be these gigantic technological and industrial forces.
Well, Don, don't you think that different generations in American history have different issues, different agendas? I mean, I think of the 18th century, the challenge that attracted the best minds of the time had to be with the designing and establishing of a republic. I think the period of the early 19th century saw itself as somehow working out that heritage, making sure the Union lasted, dealing with the question of equality. The war itself changes the country. There are entirely different issues at the top of the agenda afterwards. And it came, I think, in part out of the war itself, the way this expanded federal government was encouraging a concentration of money, the growth of large corporations. A whole new world came out, and the challenge then had to be in the private sector. It was economic far more than it was political.
Foreigners came over to observe the country in the 70s, 1870s, and 80s. This is what struck them about the country, you know?
But I don't think it's just going after the big buck. It's not just being rich. There's a real challenge here, and how you organize national corporations, national businesses, how you manage it. It had an appeal independent of the return.
There's a new cultural ethos that's helping to shape a set of beliefs about competition, about individualism itself that I think comes out of the war and that affects this period. You know, if the period before the war is a period of romance and sentiment, the period after the war is this period of realism, of hard, cold fact. And there's a sense of the individual, rather than being in solitary pursuit of upward mobility, that individual is now in competition, direct competition with other individuals. And this becomes validated. This becomes part of the everyday discourse of society. You talk about that engine, you know, that cordless engine that ran the Centennial in 1876. It was described as an athlete of steel and iron. And the sports metaphor takes over the society in all kinds of ways. You know, this is a world where in the last half of the 19th century, where, you know, football was invented. You talk about industrial technological forces. Think about football as this game on a grid about acquiring territory in combat formation with one another.
Soldiers' fields.
Sure, exactly.
The popularity of boxing.
Precisely, the most popular sport in the period, and it starts as bare knuckle boxing, round after round of boxers pummeling each other. And even by the time they move away from that and put on gloves, you have images of these fights. It's the most popular spectator sport in America. And the audience sits there and has bloodlust at these figures of these powerful men going at it, coming at you into the ring. That sense of muscularity, that sense of strength, you can see it time and again in the images of the period as workers expose their bodies to show their muscles, as other figures continue to engage in this battle for nothing less than survival.
Some historians argue that it wasn't democracy that we were known for in the 19th century. The argument that we're known for a nation of builders, builders of skyscrapers and these great arching bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge and these stupendous roaring steel mills and things. And that's what people were taken to. You know, that was the glamour of America. And that's what America had to export to the rest of the world. That's what they saw, their modernization.
But I think we've underplayed the point that Pauline made so eloquently earlier, and that is that this is a democratic republic founded on constitutional premises, and that the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and all those values are fundamental. And that in a lot of ways, I think throughout the 19th century, people who look at this nation see it differently as a result of that.
Were they seeing that, Waldo, at the time of the Civil War? What people in Europe would have been seeing is we're at each other's throats, and this experiment's about to disintegrate.
I think what it shows is the complexity, the difficulty, how, you know, it's a nation with a very brief history. And you create a structure, and over time you see how that structure might work.
Is that the thing?
In some ways, we're going to look at a legacy from the period. The fact that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, they probably couldn't have been passed under any other circumstances, right? They're passed as conditions for the southern states to come back into the Union. I mean, those will serve as an important legacy, if not for a civil rights movement in the 1870s, certainly for one in the 1950s and 1960s.
And it meant that those who were arguing for a real equality could do it under law.
Under law.
That the law was already on the books. You just had to realize the promise that had already been made as a commitment.
America at its centennial was envisioned in dramatically different ways by those living through the times. Red Horse, a Sioux warrior, painted at least 40 pictographs of Custer and the Little Bighorn. In his telling, there is little that is heroic. Warriors go about the business of destroying an invading army, and the brutalities are rendered simply as facts of battle. In 1881, John Mulvaney offered a triumphal narrative of the same event. Custer is dressed in uniform and with saber in hand, though in actuality he had neither that day. He holds off the fateful moment of his death. Walt Whitman viewed the painting as the epitome of what he called the Western phase of America. Nothing like it in Homer or Shakespeare, he said. Not only troops wound west, but trains as well. On May 10th, 1869, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific joined at Promontory, Utah, and the first transcontinental line was completed. Andrew Russell took a photograph of the moment as men and machine unite in triumph and celebration. But not everyone applauded industrial technology. In the summer of 1877, workers went on strike against the leading railroad companies, which had slashed wages. When the government called out troops, strikers attacked the engines and tracks at the center of their grievance. Whatever tensions existed, Americans tried repeatedly to depict the westward movement as one of progress. John Gass portrayed liberty as the star of empire, leading technology and commerce into the darkness of the frontier. Some images sought to confirm the divinely ordained destiny of the nation. A popular print in the 1870s was William Henry Jackson's Mountain of the Holy Cross, a peak located near the Continental Divide. But other photographers raised questions about the meaning of the landscape. Timothy O'Sullivan took pictures of ancient ruins, of a human form shrouded in steam rising from a chasm, and of blinding sand dunes with a carriage and horses paused in time, the tracks and footprints soon to be erased. America was old as well as new, destructive as well as regenerative, and the land had a secret history that was all its own.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.